Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jay Wong, Director of the Center on Public Diplomacy at the University of Southern California. This event is jointly hosted by CPD and Sanctuary Counsel. Today, we are pleased to launch a new critical issues report titled Socially Distanced Diplomacy, the Future of Soft Power and Public Diplomacy in a Fragile World. The report captures insights from leading international foreign policy experts and practitioners on the fundamental shifts to the global balance of soft power and challenges to diplomacy in the age of COVID-19. It also puts forward recommendations for effective diplomacy in a post-pandemic world, focusing on the diplomatic challenges and opportunities for the new Biden administration, as well as the British government as it seeks to implement the priorities articulated in the recently published Integrated Review of Security, Defense, Development, and Foreign Policy. I know this is the season of reports and recommendations of this kind. We have seen plenty of them already. Our report adds value as it represents a global comparative assessment and provides an empirically informed interpretive account of the shifting dynamics. It draws on perspectives from across the US, UK, Europe, India, Southeast Asia, Japan, and Australia and New Zealand. Indeed, the study and practice of soft power and public diplomacy is an expanding field, and it is global in nature. This time of momentous change and uncertainty heightens the need for trust building in global affairs. And at its core, public diplomacy is about creating and maintaining relationships. The communication space, flattened by digital technology, has become ever more competitive with active engagement by a multitude of actors and networks. Most importantly, the time calls on us to think bigger in exploring openings and possibilities in new models of engagement. For the Center on Public Diplomacy, we believe there's never been a better time to get involved and to lead the field building effort in public diplomacy. For the launch of the report, we have with us today a distinguished panel of public diplomacy practitioners experts to discuss the future of the practice as the world looks beyond the pandemic, including the latest developments in the context of a reset in American foreign policy and the UK's post-Brexit reset. Now, before we get started, I'd like to point out a few features of the webinar platform. Audience members will be in listen-only mode for the duration of the program, and we encourage you to submit your questions using the chat function in your control panel throughout the discussion, and we'll answer as many as we can during the Q&A portion of our program. Now, I'd like to introduce Jonathan McClory, who will provide an overview of the report, its findings and recommendations. Jonathan is a partner at Sanctuary Counsel and is a globally recognized expert on soft power, public diplomacy, and place branding, and is known for his pioneering work on the Soft Power 30 Index. So Jonathan, I turn the program over to you.
Thanks so much, Jay, and thank you as well to everyone for joining us from wherever in the world that you are today. We're very happy to have all of you. So very quickly, I want to give an overview of the project, and let me just start with what we did and why. So the research methodology of this project was built around 7 private roundtables that we held in the closing months of 2020. These were organized around a structured set of questions, standardized across all groups, but with a couple of tweaks based on the geospecific variations of the different roundtable groups. Now, there were 3 objectives to this roundtable series, and indeed the project as a whole. So the first, we wanted to test if there had been any changes in the perceptions of the global balance of soft power as a result of the pandemic. And within that, we wanted to test if there had been changes to the way people think about soft power, the way they think about forming an opinion of other countries. And of course, we wanted to identify the major challenges to the practice of public diplomacy in the current context. And from that, we wanted to identify some of the adaptations that have worked particularly well so far, and then also sketch out further solutions going forward. Now, who took part in these roundtable sessions? Well, we had 121 participants representing 21 different countries. And the roundtable series brought together both practitioners, but experts as well. And the graphic that you can see on this slide shows the professional background of our participants. So it was a mix of mostly government, diplomats, NGOs, think tanks, academia, but also we had participants from private sector, media, international organizations, and cultural industries as well. Now, where did we hold these roundtable sessions? Obviously, they were all held on platforms like this, Zoom or WebEx, but each group was obviously in one geography. And so we ran these sessions in, well, what that map says, and I think Jay actually already listed all of them. So I'll just quickly move along to save time. So key findings on the pandemic's impact on soft power is what I want to share first before coming to public diplomacy. The first big takeaway is that the pandemic has changed the way that experts and diplomatic practitioners form their opinion of countries. And we thought this is quite a big deal, really. This was the first question that we put across to our roundtable groups. We asked them, had the pandemic changed the composition or the weighting of factors that drive the way that they assess the favorability of a given country? The overwhelming majority, 91%, said that the pandemic had changed the way they assess other countries. And this essentially means that the criteria for a given country's attractiveness and its soft power has changed as a result of the pandemic. I guess being a bit self-critical, we didn't spend enough time on this. I think there's a lot to unpack here. If it has changed, how has it changed exactly? And I think that warrants further research, as we haven't gotten into it now. Comparing regional blocks, Asia has benefited the most reputationally. That probably shouldn't really surprise anybody, but this was a question that we asked what region gained the most in terms of impact of the pandemic. So Asia was, head and shoulders above everybody else. The only thing that I would mention is that I think it's perhaps worth asking, why didn't Oceania do a bit better in the assessment of our panel experts, especially as Australia and New Zealand have done well to contain the pandemic, but don't seem to have gained any reputational benefit from that. The third point is that US soft power has taken a clear hit. That shouldn't really surprise us, but we asked, asking about winners and losers, how has the US done? It clearly came out a loser. 89% of our experts said that they thought the US, took a hit as a result of the pandemic. As I say, it shouldn't really surprise us at all, but at least we have the data to back it up now. Of course, we wanted to look at a comparison with China. This is going to be the most important bilateral relationship this century. So how has China done compared to the US in this question? And what we found is that China has also taken a soft power hit, but the picture is a bit more nuanced. I mean, the majority still felt that China was a loser in terms of soft power impact, but there was a significant minority who felt that China actually came out a winner. Other countries thought, well, maybe there was no impact or they weren't sure. But basically, it's not quite as clear as the assessment on the effect on the US. The final point on soft power is that American soft power is expected to bounce back, but probably not to pre-2016 levels. With the new administration, we wanted to know from our panels whether they thought American soft power could recover under a new president. Basically, plurality felt it would recover, but not to pre-Trump levels. Some were a bit more optimistic, thinking that it could return to pre-2016 levels. That was only 18% of people, whereas nearly 30% of our panel felt that actually there's been a fundamental shift in the way people see the United States, and it's never going to recover in a significant way. So let me come on to public diplomacy now. Current challenges and guiding principles going forward for public diplomacy. Now, obviously, everything's gone online, much like this event. So we asked our panels whether or not the tools of digital diplomacy, are they enough to make up for the loss in person-to-person engagement or exchanges? And I don't think the results were necessarily a surprise. We had the majority of people saying, no, it doesn't allow us to do everything, but we can get halfway there. We can achieve half of what we need to with digital tools. Some were a bit more optimistic. We had 22% feel that they could achieve about 3/4 of what they need to, but others were less optimistic, with 16% saying they can only do about 1/4 of what they need to with digital tools, and a small number saying they can't even function. So really the big takeaway is digital diplomacy and digital platforms kept the show on the road, basically, but it's not a substitute for face-to-face engagement. So finally, the roundtable session raised a number of current challenges to public diplomacy. We structured these into 3 types, essentially. Now, there's plenty of detail in the report, so I won't really go into these beyond just saying what they were, but the first was structural challenges, and really the way that public diplomacy and even foreign ministries, how they are structured and how they're run is antiquated and not up to speed with where we are, particularly with technology. Second type of challenge was digital. This is really around historic underinvestment in digital capability and capacity. And then finally, pandemic challenges, which kind of speak for themselves, where everything but digital diplomacy stops. I think the challenge will be how we get going, particularly with partners that a number of embassies or governments work with who are struggling just for financial survival. Finally, guiding principles going forward. Now, there are 5 in the report, which of course I'd encourage you to read, but I just want to highlight 3 before I hand over to our distinguished panel. The first is that we have to prepare for a hybrid world of diplomacy, where all forms of engagement will incorporate some amount of in-person and some amount of digital elements. And this is a good thing. We should celebrate this, and we should use it to increase inclusion and reach new audiences, ideally younger audiences, and expand access to various exchange or public diplomacy initiatives. Second point is we need to have political leaders and foreign ministries bringing citizens and domestic politics into the process of foreign policy making and empowering citizens and civil society to play a much larger role in diplomatic efforts abroad. This was a point that was made very strongly in a number of the roundtables, particularly the US, particularly the UK. Finally, I think really all diplomats and governments need to take a page out of the book of the scientific community, follow their example in terms of international collaboration, and we need to put partnership at the heart of foreign policy and public diplomacy initiatives going forward. I'm going to leave it there as an overview. That's just a sample menu of what's in the report. And I'd like to hand over to Macon Phillips, who's going to moderate our panel discussion. And Macon Phillips is the CEO of Starling Strategy, and he is the former White House head of new media, and also the coordinator of the International Information Programs as part of the State Department. I'm going to hand over to Macon, who will introduce the rest of our esteemed panel. Thanks very much, Macon. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Jonathan, and I just want to make sure you can hear me well and everything. So I'm really excited to be here, and thank you to Jay and the team at USC for inviting me, and then to Jonathan, as well as Helen Meyer and their colleagues at Sanctuary for putting together this terrific event and this important report. It's a really great topic to dive into, and I'm going to move straight into our speakers. But just one thought off the top is, we're in a moment, at least here in the United States, which is my perspective of opportunity and spring, and we're going to really be using a lot of the takeaways from this data to think about our path forward after a variety of challenges over the last few years. So I want to thank all of our guests for joining us today for this discussion. It's been mentioned before, but you'll be able to ask questions of our panelists, and we'll get to those towards the end. But I have a few questions here at the top that I'm going to dive into off the bat. But first, let me introduce everybody. First up is Dr. Catherine Brown, who is a old friend of mine and colleague. There she is. Hello, Catherine. And she is the president and CEO of Global Ties US. Welcome, Catherine. Let's see. Next we have Lord Peter Ricketts. let's bring up Lord Peter Ricketts here. He is the former permanent secretary of the UK Foreign Office, the National Security Advisor, and the UK Ambassador to France. Are you here?
I certainly am, yep.
Oh, excellent, okay.
Don't know if I'm visible, but I am listening intently.
Yes, oh, excellent, okay. Well, I promise you sound different than Catherine, so I'll be able to tell you apart. Next we have, another, there he is, hello. We have another former colleague of mine from the State Department, Ambassador Maureen Cormack. Let's see, Maureen, are you there? She'll be here in just a second. She's the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of European, there she is, and Eurasian Affairs, the U.S. Department of State. Hi, Maureen. Oh, wait, give me another mic check here. Are you there? Yes. Okay.
All right. Now I think we're good.
Okay. I'm gonna just a quick. When I worked at the State Department, I joined in 2013, and Maureen was my partner. She was there waiting for me, and by waiting for me, I mean she invited my wife and I to her house to have dinner with the leadership team in our bureau. She is that kind of person and really helped me get up to speed fast at the State Department. So near and dear to my heart, Maureen. It's great to have you here. I look forward to this conversation.
Thank you, mate.
And then finally, we have Kate Yorkriggs, who I'm going to give the first question to. Kate is the interim chief executive of the British Council, and it's wonderful to have you here too, Kate. Welcome.
Great, fantastic to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we're just gonna, again, kick it off with a few questions, but invite the audience to use the questions feature in the software here for your live stream, and we'll just dive right into it. So Kate, tell us a little bit about the scale of adaptation that the British Council has had to take during this pandemic. You know, people talk a lot about how this has been certainly a crisis first and foremost, but within it, I think some people call it an acceleration of change towards something else. And certainly it would be, I think, wrong to think about anything close to a return to any kind of normalcy. So what has the British Council been doing, and how is it changing for the future?
Well, I mean, it's something we've been at since, last February, I suppose. And the pandemic definitely did have a very acute impact on our day-to-day operations. So we are based in 110 countries around the world, and where we deliver cultural relations, soft power activities, and 90% of our offices were closed at the height of the pandemic. And all of the activities, therefore, that we deliver to our colleagues, to our partners, to our customers, all basically stopped overnight. So that has a really detrimental effect on our finances, but also on our ability to reach people, and that's what we're there for. So we had to adapt really, really fast, and we pivoted to a digital delivery very, very quickly. Previously, before the pandemic, we were only reaching really a few hundred people online with our English program. So, we teach English all over the world as a key soft power tool. And we now have 85,000 regular learners of English online, and we are set to have many, many more. We've developed a whole set of new products where we beam in teachers into people's sitting rooms now, whereas before we really didn't have that possibility. And we think that our teaching operations will increasingly happen online. We have busy adults who don't want to travel halfway across Cairo to go and sit in a lesson when they can have an English teacher beamed into their sitting room, and then they can go and look after their kids or carry on working, whatever. So we think that model will grow and grow and grow. We think for young people, for young learners of English, actually, parents will always want that to happen face to face, but we will have a more kind of hybrid model perhaps for them. But we've also found that our work in culture and the arts, which is actually, all the research tells us that in moments of stress, actually people rely on things like community, they rely on friends and family and support, but actually they all also rely on the comfort of arts and culture. And all the research that we've done in the pandemic has shown how important that has been to people's well-being. So we moved a lot of our arts and culture work online. We have something called #CultureConnects Us, which is a big campaign around the world run digitally. We've run 2 festivals of the arts through digitally in Japan and in Italy, bringing together practitioners in the UK and those countries online. We've worked with regional governments and national governments, particularly in places like Pakistan and Ethiopia, where we've delivered English lessons on TV and radio, because I think relying only on digital actually, means that you don't reach as many people as you possibly could. So what's going to stick beyond? Definitely our digital capacity that we didn't know we had as an organization. And it took the pandemic to create the environment for my colleagues around the world to know that they could do that. We reckon that we will be reaching 1 million Russians with meaningful online engagement by 2023. Huge numbers of people in countries where, we feel the values of the UK that we bring are so important. But we also think the face-to-face won't disappear. And I know we're going to come on to that later, but we want to retain our hybrid model in the future, because in order to build the trust that cultural relations and soft power work does, actually, I think you will always need to retain some of the face-to-face. So we have learned so much about our own capability and our ability to adapt that very, very quickly. And, the future is other means of delivery to much large audiences through digital.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Kate. And I want to take this next to Catherine and pick up on some of what Kate was saying. Catherine, you approach it from an exchange perspective, from a people-to-people diplomacy perspective. But I also know in your background, you have experience working in social media companies and different tech angles. So you have a pretty full spectrum of experiences. So I kind of have a 2-part, one that sort of picks up off of what Kate was saying, and then another that's more about your work. When we talk about face-to-face engagement and how we need, that will always be part of this. I see face-to-face and digital diplomacy as sort of a spectrum. It's not a choice of either or. And I'm sure as someone who's in the exchange world, which was grounded in a very real world, offline origin, you're looking at how digital is integrated into that face-to-face. So I'd love for you to speak a little bit to that spectrum, but also more generally talk about that while there's a lot of downsides to the pandemic, there must be some really exciting positive things that have come out of this challenge, like in any organization. So can you speak a little bit to what's really exciting in your world?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Macon, for the question, and great to see you. Great to see you all. Congratulations, Jonathan and Jay, on the report. It's an exciting day. A lot of work went into this. And so to answer your question, Macon, yes, I agree with you. I see it as a spectrum as well. And to take your second question first about the positive aspects of the last year, I think there's several positive developments. And as we say in the report, historic global events often reinforce the critical need to build relationships that foster peace and collaboration to solve global challenges. We saw that post-World War II, post-Cold War, post-9/11. And the COVID-19 pandemic, it's been no different. It's provided us a tremendous opportunity to slow down and really reimagine what public diplomacy should look like. And I think first and foremost, we've been reminded about the primacy of listening in public diplomacy. I'm channeling Nick Cole here, who's constantly emphasizing this. But for my colleagues in the Global Ties Network, we support more than 80 member organizations across the country, and they helped implement the International Visitor Leadership Program, the United States' largest, oldest, most foundational exchange program. And that, of course, turned virtual. But with the active travel and constant activity involved with exchanges eliminated, there's a singular focus on speaking and listening. And my colleagues found ways for community-to-community connections with program alumni to better understand how others were coping and adapting to the pandemic, and to really listen to one another. And I agree with Kate, we want to build trust, then meaningful engagement requires that listening. And it's really important that we don't lose that when the hustle of in-person activity resumes. And second, that focus on listening has also led us to another positive, to prioritize being more inclusive of diverse voices, both at home and abroad. As Jonathan was saying, 2020 was more than the pandemic in the United States. It was about the overdue need for racial justice in this country, and our soft power rests on credibility, and we need to embrace our stated democratic values at home if we're going to have that credibility abroad. And this is a huge priority for the Biden administration. So moving values of diversity and equity and inclusion to the center of a national dialogue is essential to being and projecting a truly open society. And so I think a positive from the pandemic is that we're seeing more and more that our domestic engagement matters for our foreign policy. And here we have this tremendous opportunity to leverage citizen diplomacy, which is understanding that citizens have the right and the responsibility to be part of foreign affairs. And so through various public diplomacy programs, we can simultaneously engage with our fellow citizens and with foreign publics and lift up diverse voices. And the last thing I'll say to your point about like this being a spectrum, I think often we've seen digital diplomacy as like its own kind of niche part of public diplomacy. It's kind of seen as being exclusive or different than kind of the in-person engagement. And I think what we've learned now, consistent with what Kate was saying, was that they need one another. Every relationship, has several touch points, whether it be digital, via phone, or in-person engagement. And our exchange programs need to reflect that as well. And so we also know the limitations of technology. We know we haven't been able to be so inclusive with audiences that we want to target, while also being able to broaden audiences. So we need to be open-eyed about the limitations, but also continue to kind of iterate and improve hybrid programming, and seeing virtual enhancements to our in-person work. And so I'm really excited and energized by all the lessons that we've learned the last year, and looking forward to where public diplomacy is going next.
Thank you, Catherine. And such an important point. I just want to underscore about the need to listen and not just speak in public diplomacy. And in my time at State Department and sort of working in different organizations, I sort of joke about the desire to have more cowbell, to put out more information, to broadcast and have bigger and larger audiences. And I think what you describe is the need to have deeper relationships where you might actually learn something from somebody instead of just convince them that you're awesome. I think that is not a new idea in public diplomacy, and I think we'll hear that from Maureen in just a second. But it's certainly a really important reminder, because too often we're trying to get out there and share the good news, evangelize about who we are and whatever our mission is. But the audience now wants to be heard and deserves to be heard, and that's the challenge and the opportunity. I think you put it really well. Speaking of challenges and opportunities, I get to ask a State Department diplomat about Europe now. It has been an interesting few years there, Maureen, and I know that when I was there working with you, we were looking at everything from work that was happening with France and Italy around the International Food Fair and all of this other cool stuff to, what was happening in Eastern Ukraine, and really looking at some of these ideas that, as much as foreign policy may be about engaging our adversaries or people who are different than us, that it's also important to keep an eye on these alliances and understand our friends. And it's been an interesting few years between the United States and Europe, and would love your take on where we are with US-European relations, given your current seat, and the storylines that you see as we move forward and seek to strengthen that relationship and perhaps learn from the last few years. So what are you thinking about there as you're looking ahead to what the administration is trying to do in Europe and how public diplomacy plays a role in that?
Yeah, no, thank you, Macon. And President Biden from day one has set out the goal of reaffirming and revitalizing our alliances, right? So for us in the Bureau of European Affairs, that is so committed to NATO, to our work with the European Union on issues, our work in the OSCE, we're very happy to really dig in on this effort. President Biden and Secretary Blinken together have really set out an agenda that has already included, as you know, significant travel The Secretary is in London this week for the G7 and meeting with partners. He was in Brussels in March for the NATO ministerial and had good meetings with the European Union. The President will be in the UK this summer for the G7 summit, and then be in Brussels for both a NATO and an EU summit. So very clear, very senior level commitment. Secretary Austin has been a part of this as well. Very good work with the Defense and State Departments on a number of important issues, including, as you note, in Ukraine, where we see serious challenges once again. And in fact, the Secretary this week will go from London to Kyiv for his first visit to Ukraine as Secretary of State to reinforce our commitment to that part of the world. As we look at all of this, including partnering with the EU on important issues like China in a much more structured way than we have in the past, it's clear that public diplomacy is absolutely critical, right? And I think I'm speaking to the converted here, but this has been a really interesting year for us. We obviously began last March as COVID hit, slightly frozen in time, because anyone who has worked in the government knows that we don't tend to be cutting edge technology leaders. But I have to tell you, over the last year, I think the State Department has come ahead about a decade. Even things like we're doing now, right? The room I'm sitting in was a bland conference room. We've created multiple studios around the department. We have the capacity to work on pretty much all mediums now. And our posts overseas have used this as a real opportunity, right? Countries where our public diplomacy sections used to be able to reach about 30,000 people in person each year can now tell us they reach that many every month through virtual platforms. And in parts of our larger countries with less developed transportation, where we have possibly never reached audiences before. So as others have said, the British Council, we will definitely be looking to keep all of this as part of our toolkit at the same time as we do hope to get back to those in-person meetings, which, as we all know, still have real value, right? That last 3 feet, as we talk about it in the public diplomacy world, still really matters, and we have really missed being able to do that. But in the meantime, we've done all sorts of things. The Secretary of State now does virtual ministerials with foreign governments. Our own deputy assistant secretaries have done full-day meetings with governments and publics and student groups in foreign countries, gotten extensive media coverage just as if they were there, and yet never left the building. So it has been an interesting opportunity for us to do some building in new ways. 2 of those ways I just want to talk about briefly. Some of you have talked about some countries having less developed toolkits in this regard. We have created the European Digital Diplomacy Exchange, where our tech leaders in PD work with foreign ministries that are not as equipped as we are to handle this, don't have the same level of resources, to give them the training, to help them develop the technology, to do their own outreach on these important issues. And we really look to partner with them to help them make progress, because we're very aware that alone we are not a totally effective voice. It has to be inside of these alliances and partnerships. The other thing that our Educational and Cultural Affairs Bureau has done is to create something called the Digital Communication Network that started as a series of exchange programs, is now actually an independent NGO with about 7,500 professionals that work together across everything from investigative journalism to technology development to program development, still supported by the State Department, but very much operating outside of the government circles. So, I think that we still have some hard times ahead of us. We all know disinformation, misinformation are huge problems that we're all dealing with. We will only be effective doing that together. And some of these platforms have really strengthened our ability to do that.
Thanks, Maureen. And I'm speaking as an American taxpayer. We're lucky to have you in one of the pilot seats here trying to navigate it. But you're right, it's a challenge. And I want to bring it to Lord Peter Ricketts. Lord Peter Ricketts, who certainly knows challenges well from his experience, to talk a little bit about the path forward for the United Kingdom, particularly in light of its review, its integrated review of its foreign policy. I was thinking about this, and even though the UK and the United States certainly have a special relationship, as we say, and I'm very familiar with that country, I've thought more about it, or with the kingdom. I've thought more about it recently than ever before, whether it's the Brexit and political questions, whether it's the challenges from the coronavirus and what you've had to endure there, or the royal family, and certainly a lot of the cultural storylines that are coming out. And so as we think about the ambition of the UK, how do you connect that to its soft power and its capacity to really tell a story about where it wants to see itself in the world?
Well, thank you very much, Macon, and congratulations to the organisers. I agree with an awful lot of what's been said. And I do believe that crisis and disruption are often opportunities for innovation and creativity. And I can see that going on across the public diplomacy sphere and in many other areas as well. As you say, we've had an integrated review of our defence and security and foreign policy recently, which was a kind of stock-taking partly of what assets and powers the UK still has. I'd be less than honest if I didn't say that, in my view, leaving the EU has diminished somewhat Britain's impact and standing in the world, partly the way it was done. But now we need to move on from that and develop a new kind of national strategy. So in a way, Britain is facing more of a moment of disruption than any other Western country, I think. We're all having to adjust to the new geopolitics of great power rivalry, but Britain's also got to find a new way in the world after leaving the EU. And I think what came through in that review, and I think is absolutely right, is that the country does still have some very significant powers, soft power. The review declared an ambition for the UK to be a soft power superpower. Our language, like shared in many cases with America, our heritage, our education sector, our science and technology sector. There are many areas of attractiveness in the UK. I would have said until very recently, our development policy, which has been one of the world leaders in development, in poverty reduction, but also in helping many other problems of the world, public health, girls' education, family planning, clean water, and a lot of things. That has taken a hit recently as a result of a reduction in our aid budget, quite a sudden kind. And so I would say to our own government that we have to be quite careful to husband our influencing resources and to make the most of them. I do think that the world is now at one of those turning points as we begin to build out of the pandemic. I'd say that in the first year of the pandemic, the countries that did best in the soft power league tables, and that come through rather in Jonathan's report, are those that were competent, those that showed that they could make decisions clearly, carry public opinion with them in coping with the first phase of the pandemic. I think the second year is going to be as much about which countries can help others, can show that they are genuinely helping those who have less through development programs, through making vaccines available through the COVAX program and others. That's, I think, one of the major topics of the G7 at which Secretary Blinken is in London today. And I think that gives us an opportunity in the West to show once again our mettle here, and having perhaps lost some ground with many countries in the first year of the pandemic, to show that we actually are the countries that are thinking about the well-being of many poorer countries around the world, and that where China operates a very aggressive vaccine diplomacy, it often comes with quid pro quos, whereas Western help, I hope, will be altruistic and will recognize the point that we're none of us safe until everyone's safe. I think a problem with the British integrated review, and I think it's typical of documents of this kind, is that it doesn't really prioritize. And I think that Britain is still in a phase of adapting to the fact that we are an important, influential, middle-sized power with many assets, but we are no longer a great power. And it's quite a painful adaptation process that is going on. My last point, I think, is that if you're going to have a successful national strategy, you have to involve young people. You have to make sure that their voices are heard, that their priorities are taken into account, because it's their world which will be the one that we're creating through the decisions we take over the next few years. So I think one of the big issues for public diplomacy in the UK now is to mount a real campaign to involve a national debate around the kind of country that we're going to be in the next 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. And you said something that leads me to my next question that I want to. We're going to get to the audience questions here very soon. We've already got them coming in, so I'm going to skip some of these internal ones so we have more time there. But I want to ask one last question. I'm going to try to do this actually to two people, which is again the two Americans here. Maybe I'm showing my bias. Sorry, but Ambassador Cormack and Catherine. Because you know, Ambassador, you're on the .gov side, as I like to say, you know, and Catherine maybe is pretty close to the .gov side, but you know, technically not. So I can hold you to this, you know. But Lord Ricketts talked a little bit about the difference in approach of say China versus Western powers, and how China is pretty quid pro quo, and we would like to think that Western engagement is a little bit more altruistic, but you know, there was this guy Trump who kind of very clearly pointed out how he felt about it, and I think gave voice and was an avatar for a lot of concern that people around the world they've had for a long time, and we just didn't want to hear. So whether it's true or not, you know, one of the strongest quid pro quo arguments has been made by the previous U.S. president, and I'd like to hear a little bit about, given that you've been around, you've seen a bunch of different administrations, Maureen, you can put this in context. For me, you know, this is a big part of my experience, but for you, you've seen a lot of these ups and downs and side to sides. How do you set about the task of rebuilding trust? You know, how do you acknowledge the past, but also begin to open up this future when it's been really challenging the last few years?
Well, I think trust is an important quality in anything that we do, right? And certainly in international relations as much as any other relationship. You know, President Biden has been clear that, you know, one thing that surfaced over the course of time in the United States is a real need to recalibrate foreign policy to the needs of the American people. And I think that that theme will continue through this administration. We certainly have been tasked inside the State Department with really thinking hard about how American citizens' needs are filtered both into the policy decision-making process and then implementation. And I think that's right. You know, I've been at this several decades. I think Lord Peter has a similarly long career. You know, there was a moment when we thought that globalization would simply benefit everyone naturally in the course of time. And we see that that has not happened. And we have to take very seriously our responsibility to our own citizens and figure out how to address that. You know, one of the things that we have done going forward is to try and build real partnerships. And so, you know, still very much behind the scenes, but we work closely with partners across Europe to take on some of the challenges today. Russian disinformation, you know, Chinese debt diplomacy, other things that are really impacting not only Europe, but South America, Africa, multiple parts of the world. And I think it's those partnerships that are going to allow us to put in place and really institutionalize ways of doing things that maybe will put that trust back into place and allow us to move forward more productively in the future. Inside the building, we work very closely with the GEC, the Global Engagement Center, to really try and open up and reveal some of the malign activities that are taking place and have gotten pretty strong reactions from Russia and others to sort of exposing what is going on there. The report in August of 2020 called Pillars of Russia's Disinformation and Propaganda Ecosystem is one that I would point people to if you're interested. And Russia reacted pretty strongly to that. So honesty and truth are pretty powerful tools. And the key is getting out there and not being afraid to use them.
Thanks. And ask the same question to Catherine. I think just having a different perspective, having been in the building, but now one step out of it, what's it like to kind of be moving forward in a post-Trump world, given the impact on trust?
Well, first I'll say I wholeheartedly agree with Ambassador Cormack, and I believe that, you know, building trust is at the core of the mission of Global Ties US, the organization I had the privilege of running. And I also had the privilege of supporting a mission that specifically tries to build that trust through our citizens. And I know that, you know, for the last 4 years, due to the steadfast support of foreign service officers and civil service officers in particular at the Education and Cultural Affairs Bureau, our citizen diplomats felt incredibly supported, and helping to show foreign visitors through IVLP and other exchange programs what a multidimensional society America is, that, you know, what American values are, and that we are openly grappling with our problems, that we're seeking to become a more perfect union. And I believe that our citizens are one of our greatest soft power assets that we have. And we have thousands, you know, of citizens across the country who are engaged in citizen diplomacy work, who want to be active in U.S. foreign policy. And I think that we need to continue to leverage them through subnational diplomacy networks, through IVLP, through other exchange programs that work with our network and other citizen diplomacy networks, to really build that trust, build meaningful relationships, and to afford the space to listen, back to my original point. But I think that to increase the scale of trust, there needs to be an increase of scale of public diplomacy programming. And this is where it kind of goes back to Congress. As you know, Macon, that was a big part of my job when we worked together, was communicating back to our members of Congress why public diplomacy matters for U.S. foreign policy, why the toolkit is so essential for building alliances. And it is, you know, for the last 4 years during the Trump administration, you had members of Congress who knew that international affairs was not transactional, not quid pro quo, that it was based on relationships, and that exchanges in public diplomacy was critical to building that relationships. So they maintain the public diplomacy budget. They maintain the ability for us to do our work. Now there is a call to further increase the scale of international exchange programs. And I can say this because I'm not in government, you know, by 30%. And I feel like that is really, really important for us to continue to build the trust that we need through our citizens, you know, and for our alliances to solve global challenges together, that is absolutely critical that we have more funding to do that.
Thank you. Catherine, you mentioned in that answer, which I think is agree with and really appreciate your perspective on, you know, the emerging role of subnational actors. And that's one of the questions we just got from the audience. And so I want to give this one to Kate. Perhaps you can try putting your British Council hat on, but I also think it's a more general question about public diplomacy. Let me first find the question. What are your views about public diplomacy implemented by subnational governments and actors? Is PD an attribute of the central government only, or should cities and regions also engage in this endeavor? And if so, what do you foresee as the benefit? And I'll just add to this question, you know, I was always struck at how the British Council certainly had more of its own identity than US, public diplomacy in a lot of contexts. You know, the FCO versus the British Council is very, you know, there's a lot of distance, you know, between that. Whereas I think you could say more integrated, or at least less intentional in some ways about how we approach it. And so you already had this sort of separate national actor in the British Council. But I'm sure it's occurred to you as you're doing your work that you're seeing other kinds of actors in the space. And so what's your reaction to this idea on the merits of subnational actors, and what are trends you see in that space?
Yeah, I mean, I think our philosophy at the British Council, and actually in many countries who've set up similar organizations like the British Council, so the Goethe Institute, the Institut Français, and also now the Confucius Institutes that China has invested in massively around the world. There's been a huge increase in numbers of centers. Is that the best soft power and cultural relations activity has to be funded by government, but actually delivered outside of government confines. So the British Council, you know, is obviously very aligned to the integrated review ambitions of the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office criteria and objectives. However, in order to do that work well through education, through English and through the arts, you have to deliver it at arm's length from government. I mean, we work with some young people in the most fragile of states around the world. They simply would not come and engage with us if we were sitting in embassy buildings. So we have separate buildings, we have a different approach and style, it's a much more open door policy, because our target audience is young people effectively, and to work with those young people to connect them with the best of British ideas, the best of British culture, education, etc. And those are the assets that people are continue to see as attractive, despite what Peter's described as a sort of decline in other areas. People are still interested in our arts, in our culture, in our education, and in our language. I think cities play a really important part, and in a country like the UK, where you have devolved administrations, actually they have a really important part to play in the UK's kind of profile around the world. So Scotland, for example, has a really developed international strategy. They have their own set of ambitions and objectives within that, and they have some resource to reach out, and the British Council very much supports all of the devolved administration and their priorities around the world, and we actively promote those. But I think also, there's some really interesting city-to-city work that happens around the world. So, we have a range of cities of culture in the UK. Hull was one of the last ones. Coventry is the one coming up, and they have international links as well. And I think those are really good, kind of the extra dimension of the people-to-people links. And then, of course, there's a whole kind of dimension of civil society. And as Peter said, actually, the UK's development work has been one of its key soft power assets in the past, and civil society delivering a lot of that work and a lot of that funding through its project work has been hugely important in terms of the profile of a country who does this work well. So they're massively important, definitely.
Yeah, thank you. Any other thoughts on the subnational actors before I move to the next question?
Yeah, just very briefly, I'll add one. We have something called the State Partnership Program that I don't think is well known, which is the National Guard from many of our states partnered with particularly countries of the former Soviet Union to help them develop a democratic military. And they have done absolutely extraordinary work, often moving from an initial military relationship to a combination of a military and civil relationship with governors, with state houses, becoming involved with the countries as well. And so in the Baltics, in the Balkans, across Eastern Europe, this has really contributed significantly to the development of these countries. And the National Guard really deserves a shout out for their good work there.
Great, thank you. That's great. And the next question, and I think we're may have time for one more after this, and then we'll wrap it up, is for Lord Ricketts. One of the key findings from this work, this question comes from Singapore, so anticipate the topic. One of the key findings is that Asia gained the most in soft power standing emerging from this crisis. And what did they do well? When you think about that part of the world and how it's showing up in the international community, what do you think we could learn from Asian countries in terms of the growth of their soft power?
Well, that's great. It was my first posting in the 1970s, Singapore, so it's always been close to my heart. I think the Asian countries had a number of advantages. One was that many of them had to cope with a serious public health crisis within the last few years. And I think their resilience planning was better than many Western countries who had not had to cope with the same kind of crisis. I think in many as well, the government has got good systems for public engagement, high levels of trust and confidence in the decisions of governments, all of which allowed them to move rapidly, take evidence-based decisions, and take clear decisions based on that. I think that many Western countries, including the UK, lag behind. But I think now, as I said earlier, the second phase of this is going to be not so much about how competent were you in handling the pandemic in your own country, but also how effective are you going to be at helping others who are now struggling. And there I do think other countries, including the US and the UK, have a real opportunity to help. I just make one other comment, I think, for the public diplomacy professionals listening to us on this broadcast. That is the difficulty of doing the listening that Catherine and others have talked about in a climate of polarized, divided, political systems and cultures. I think listening, is really hard when there are populists in many of our political communities who are only shouting out and who are increasingly denigrating objective truth and facts and not listening to other points of view. Somehow we have to work together to reclaim an area where there can be public debate and people can disagree with each other in rational, reasonable terms without the kind of extremely atomized identity politics, which I think is increasingly dominating the public sphere, certainly in the UK, and I think has been in the US as well. I hope that we can find a way around that, but I think we have to recognize it is a problem.
Excellent. Yes, thank you. And I think we're going to get to our last question here, unless anyone else had comments about Asia that they want to make before we move to one last topic. Okay. So this one is about, it was an interesting question that came from the audience. A new observation scholars have is that domestic digital diplomacy, which questions whether some of digital diplomacy efforts are more for domestic audiences than foreign publics, which don't necessarily fit in the latter interests. Now, this is fascinating to me because of things like Smith-Munt and all these other kind of like excuse frameworks that that created a lot of bureaucratic sort of idiosyncrasies at state, and I hope no one has to learn about what that actually means. But it sort of left us really having those two things disconnected. And Ambassador, you mentioned that President Biden really believes that making that connection of why foreign policy matters to American citizens is key. And I would go a step further to say American citizens' role in public diplomacy is the path to showing the vulnerability, showing the diversity, rebuilding the trust, Catherine, that you talked about. Of course, exchanges plays right into that. So can you talk a little bit about, let me try to think about how I can get a good answer here. What do we need to begin doing differently to really interrogate the intersection of domestic and foreign audiences around digital diplomacy?
I'll start very briefly, and then of course Catherine's work I think is at the heart of this every day, because she is really that nexus where foreign publics meet American citizens. But certainly at the State Department we have talked for many years, but more concretely now, about our need to be much more present in the United States, right? And how we structure that remains to be decided. But what we call our Hometown Diplomats program, which gets people back into their communities to talk about our work. Again, we're talking, right? And so many of you early on have talked about the importance of listening. So how do we place ourselves around the United States to listen, whether virtually or physically, and hear from American citizens who, you know, reports that have been done over the last year show are not completely oblivious to foreign affairs by any stretch of the imagination. They're quite aware that the world is important, that it can actually be very concretely helpful to them, but we have to figure out a way to strengthen those ties. So as you go forward with things like this report, we're certainly open to good ideas, and I think that we'll be looking for ways to get State Department officials, employees, staff out into the 50 American states to really start hearing from Americans how we work better together. But Catherine, over to you.
That's absolutely what needs to happen. I think that we've long talked about how the State Department and also our development, USAID, they don't have a constituency within the United States. And part of that's because of Smith-Munt, Macon, and, you know, everyone's concerned about going to Smith-Munt jail, and we'll leave it there. But essentially, it's difficult to communicate what diplomacy and development do, and how that is our first line of defense. And so I think that there's a lot of civil society groups. Of course, there's the Global Ties Network, US Global Leadership Coalition, you know, others who are working to connect the dots to the American public about why foreign policy matters, and also that foreign policy begins at home. And I think that work needs to increase in scale, and it's really encouraging seeing what the Biden administration is doing to that. So Ambassador Cormack, we welcome you, you know, throughout the Global Ties Network, you and your colleagues, and looking forward to having more diplomats out there talking to our communities.
Great. Well, we're reaching our time here, so I'm going to hand it over to Jonathan. I just first want to thank the panelists for joining. It's after this year, it's always nice just to see other faces and have a good conversation. So thank you to each of you for the work that you do and for the perspective that you provided today. And again, thank you to USC and the Sanctuary Council for having this event. And so, Jonathan, we'll bring it back to you to say goodbye.
Thanks so much, Macon, and thank you so much to our panelists as well for joining us and sharing your insight and experience. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you as well to the CPD team for organizing and obviously helping with this whole research. A big thank you to Jay Wang and to Catherine Brown as well for their contribution throughout the project, and indeed contributions to the final report itself. And thank you to all of you for joining us. We were really pleased to be able to do this, so thank you for your time. And this is really a starting point for us, this research project. We will be carrying on looking at further issues. So if you are interested, then please do get in touch, and we look forward to carrying on the conversation with you. Thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.